They mocked her at boot camp. Then the commander froze at her back tattoo. The morning fog clung to the mountains surrounding Fort Blackstone like a funeral shroud, and through it came the rumbling of an ancient Ford that looked like it had survived 3 wars and lost all of them. When the engine finally died with a wheeze that echoed across the parking lot, everyone turned to stare at the woman who climbed out. She was small, maybe 5'4" on a good day, with mousy brown hair pulled back in a simple elastic band that probably cost less than $1. Her clothes looked like they'd been picked from a donation bin. Faded grey sweatshirt with unraveling cuffs, jeans so worn the knees were nearly transparent, and boots held together by duct tape and prayer. Sophia Chen didn't look like she belonged at one of the most elite military training facilities in North America. She looked like she'd gotten lost on her way to a food bank. The other recruits, gathered near the entrance in their crisp new gear and expensive tactical watches, exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to outright contempt. This was supposed to be where the best of the best came to prove themselves, not where society's leftovers washed up. The first to speak was naturally the loudest. Marcus Steele had the kind of presence that filled doorways and dominated conversations, 6'3" of pure American confidence wrapped in designer athletic wear that screamed money. His father was a senator, his grandfather a war hero, and he carried their legacy like a weapon. "Move it or lose it," he called out as Sophia approached the entrance, deliberately stepping into her path so she had to squeeze past him. The contact was brief but intentional, his shoulder checking hers hard enough to make her stumble. She didn't fall, though. Just caught herself with the kind of balance that should have been a warning sign if anyone had been paying attention. But they weren't looking for danger in someone who dressed like she'd raided the clearance rack at Goodwill. Jessica Hart laughed first, the sound sharp as breaking glass. The daughter of a defense contractor worth billions, she had the kind of beauty that came from good genes and better surgeons. Blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold, and a smile that never reached her eyes. "Someone call security," she announced to her circle of admirers. "I think the cleaning lady is lost." The group erupted in laughter, phones already coming out to capture what they assumed would be prime entertainment for their social media followers. Here at Fort Blackstone, where every recruit had been handpicked from military academies, special forces programs, or elite athletic backgrounds, the arrival of someone so obviously out of place was like blood in the water to sharks. Sophia said nothing. She adjusted the single strap holding her backpack together, the canvas so threadbare you could see the outline of its meager contents, and walked past them toward the registration desk. Her silence only made them laugh harder. Inside the main building, the processing sergeant looked up from his computer with the expression of someone who'd seen everything and was no longer impressed by any of it. Sergeant Mills had been at Blackstone for 15 years, watching privileged kids and genuine warriors alike pass through these halls. He could usually tell within seconds which category someone belonged to. This one, though, made him pause. "Name," he grunted, fingers poised over the keyboard. "Sophia Chen," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He scrolled through his list, frowning. "Don't see you on here. You sure you're in the right place? This ain't the regular army, sweetheart. This is advanced tactical training." "I'm on the list," she said, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. The letterhead was official, the signatures legitimate, but Mills still looked skeptical as he double-checked his system. There it was, buried at the bottom like an afterthought. Chen, Sophia. No prior service record listed, no recommendations, no connections. Just a name and a clearance code he'd never seen before. He shrugged. Not his problem if someone in administration had screwed up. "Barracks 3, he said, sliding a key across the counter. "Orientation at 0600 tomorrow. Try not to die." The walk to the barracks took her past the main training grounds where some early arrivals were already showing off. Pull-up bars, obstacle courses, fighting rings, all occupied by people who moved like athletes and carried themselves like warriors. They paused to watch her pass, this small woman in thrift store clothes dragging a bag that looked older than she was. Someone wolf whistled. Another called out an offer to carry her bag that was laden with enough innuendo to make the meaning clear. She kept walking, eyes forward, pace steady, giving them nothing to work with but her silence. Barracks 3 was the furthest from the main complex, a deliberate placement that everyone understood. The rejects, the quota fills, the ones who wouldn't last a week, they all got Barracks 3. By the time Sophia found her bunk, a narrow cot with a mattress that had seen better decades, word had already spread through the compound. There was fresh meat, and it was the weakest-looking prey any of them had ever seen. That first night, someone filled her boots with shaving cream. Amateur hour harassment, the kind of thing bored recruits did when they wanted to establish pecking order without risking real consequences. Sophia discovered it when she woke at 0500, 30 minutes before the official wake-up call. She cleaned them methodically, wringing out what she could, stuffing them with paper towels from the bathroom. When she couldn't get them dry enough, she wrapped her feet in plastic bags from the trash can and wore them anyway. The morning formation was held on the main parade ground, a massive expanse of concrete that radiated heat even in the early morning. Colonel Bradley Hutton stood at the front, a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and given just enough humanity to make him dangerous. His eyes swept over the assembled recruits with the calculating gaze of someone sorting wheat from chaff. "Listen up," he barked, his voice carrying across the field without need for amplification. "You're here because someone, somewhere, thought you might be worth something. Half of you will be gone by the end of the week, another quarter by the end of the month. The few who remain might earn the right to call themselves elite. Until then, you're nothing, less than nothing. You're potential failures waiting to happen." His gaze landed on Sophia, standing in the back row trying to be invisible. He pointed directly at her. "You, thrift store, front and center." She walked forward, the plastic bags in her boots making a subtle crinkling sound with each step. A few snickers rippled through the formation, quickly silenced by Hutton's glare. "What's your story?" he demanded when she stood before him. "Lost your way to the soup kitchen?" "No, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the 100 pairs of eyes boring into her back. "Then explain to me why you look like you crawled out of a dumpster to be here." She met his gaze directly, something that surprised him, though he didn't show it. "I'm here to train, sir." The colonel circled her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "In those boots? With that gear? You're going to get someone killed, probably yourself." He turned to address the formation. "This is what happens when bureaucrats interfere with military operations. We get diversity hires who can't even dress themselves properly." The laughter was louder this time, more confident. They had permission from the top to treat her as a joke. "Back in line," Hutton commanded, dismissing her with a wave. "Try to keep up. When you fail, don't blame anyone but yourself." The physical training that followed was designed to break bodies and spirits in equal measure. 4-mile runs in full gear, endless push-ups in the mud, rope climbs that left hands bloody and raw. Sophia stayed in the middle of the pack, never excelling, never quite failing, maintaining a steady presence that should have been noteworthy for its consistency if anyone had been watching closely. But they were too busy watching her stumble when Marcus deliberately clipped her heel during a run, sending her sprawling into the dirt. Too busy laughing when Jessica loudly offered her a tampon for her bloody hands after the rope climb, suggesting she was too delicate for real training. Too busy taking videos when Derek Thompson, all muscle and no subtlety, knocked her lunch tray from her hands in the mess hall, sending food splattering across her already stained clothes. She never complained, never retaliated, just cleaned up the messes, bandaged her wounds, and showed up for the next training session. It was like watching someone slowly drowning who refused to call for help. The combat skills assessment came at the end of the first week. Hand-to-hand combat, no rules except no killing. Matches determined by submission or unconsciousness. The pairings were supposedly random, but everyone knew better when Sophia's name came up against Rebecca Stone, 6 feet of trained killer who'd been recruited from a women's MMA circuit. Rebecca didn't even bother warming up. She stood in the ring, cracking her knuckles, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "This is going to be embarrassing," she announced to the crowd, gathering around the chain-link fence. "Someone might want to have medical on standby." Sophia entered the ring wearing the same shabby clothes she'd arrived in, now held together with safety pins, where seams had split during training. She looked even smaller facing Rebecca, like a child who'd wandered into the wrong playground. The instructor, a scarred veteran named Rodriguez, who'd seen actual combat in places the recruits could only imagine, started the match with obvious reluctance. He'd seen mismatches before, but this looked like sanctioned murder. Rebecca came forward fast, throwing a haymaker that would have dropped most people. Sophia stepped aside, not dramatically, just a small shift that let the fist whistle past her ear. Rebecca followed with a knee that Sophia deflected with her forearm, then a grab for her shirt that Sophia twisted away from. "Stop running and fight," Rebecca snarled, frustrated by her inability to land anything solid. Sophia said nothing, just kept moving, always just out of reach, letting Rebecca tire herself with increasingly wild swings. It went on for 3 minutes, then 4, then 5. The crowd grew quiet, sensing something was off. This wasn't how someone untrained moved. This was something else. Rebecca finally caught her, or thought she did, wrapping both hands around Sophia's throat and slamming her against the fence. The impact was violent enough to rattle the chain link, and for a moment, everyone thought it was over. Then Sophia moved. It was so fast most people missed it, would argue about what they'd seen for days afterward. One moment she was pinned. The next, Rebecca was on the ground gasping, her arm bent at an angle that wasn't quite natural, but not quite broken either. A perfect joint lock applied with surgical precision. Sophia released her immediately and stepped back, hands at her sides, expression neutral. Rebecca rolled to her feet, face red with humiliation and rage, and charged again. This time Sophia didn't move aside. She met the charge head-on, using Rebecca's momentum against her in a throw that looked effortless, but sent the larger woman flying. Rebecca hit the mat hard enough to knock the wind out of her. The match was called. Rebecca had to be helped from the ring, her confidence as damaged as her shoulder. The crowd dispersed in uncomfortable silence, unsure how to process what they'd witnessed. The joke had fought back, and worse, she'd made it look easy. Rodriguez caught Sophia as she was leaving the ring, his voice low. "Where'd you learn that?" "YouTube," she said quietly, and walked away before he could respond. But he didn't believe her. He'd seen that kind of movement before, in places where cameras weren't allowed and the fighting was real. He made a mental note to pull her file, do some digging. Something about this woman didn't add up. The midnight hazing came 3 days later. They waited until she was asleep, 5 of them moving through the dark barracks like shadows. Marcus led them with Derek and 3 others whose names didn't matter because they were followers, not leaders. They had duct tape for her mouth, zip ties for her wrists, and plans that walked the line between harassment and assault. She woke when they were 2 feet from her bunk. Didn't scream, didn't panic, just rolled sideways off the narrow cot as Marcus lunged for where she'd been. In the darkness, she was harder to track, moving between bunks with a silence that shouldn't have been possible. "Get the lights," Marcus hissed, but when the fluorescents flickered on, she was already at the door. Not running though, just standing there, watching them with those unremarkable brown eyes that suddenly didn't look so unremarkable anymore. "Going somewhere?" Derek asked, trying to salvage the situation with bravado. She tilted her head slightly. "Are you?" The question hung in the air, loaded with something they couldn't quite identify. A promise, maybe. Or a warning. Marcus took a step forward and she took one back, maintaining the distance between them. 5 against 1, he said. You really think you can take those odds? She glanced at each of them in turn, cataloguing faces, remembering names. No, she said simply, but I don't have to. You're on camera. They turned almost in unison to look at the corner where the security camera sat, its red light blinking steadily. They'd assumed it was broken, like half the equipment in Barracks 3. The possibility that it wasn't, that their attempted assault had been recorded, drained the color from their faces. Sophia walked past them, through them really, as they stood frozen by the implications of that blinking light. She returned to her bunk, lay down and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into sleep or a convincing imitation of it. The next morning, nothing was said, no reports filed, no accusations made. But the 5 who'd tried to corner her found themselves giving her a wider berth, unsure whether the camera had been recording or not, unwilling to risk finding out. The weapons qualification was where things began to shift. Every recruit had to demonstrate proficiency with a variety of firearms, from pistols to assault rifles to long-range sniper systems. Most had trained for years, spent thousands at shooting ranges. Some had military family members who'd started teaching them before they could properly hold the weight. Sophia approached the range like she approached everything else, quietly and without fanfare. The rangemaster, a former Special Forces sniper named Torres, handed her a Glock 19 with the expression of someone going through the motions. 7 rounds center mass, he instructed, indicating the target 25 yards away. She held the weapon awkwardly at first, like she was trying to remember something from a long-ago lesson. The first shot went wide, hitting the outer ring. A few people laughed. The second was better, just outside the center. By the third shot, she'd found her rhythm. The last 4 rounds made a hole you could cover with a quarter dead center. Torres blinked, looked at the target through his spotting scope, then back at her. Lucky shots happened, but not 4 in a row. Again, he ordered. This time, all 7 were in the center, the grouping even tighter. She set the pistol down and waited for the next weapon. Torres handed her an M4 carbine, his eyes narrowing as he watched her check the weapon with movements that were almost, but not quite, professional. The rifle qualification was more complex. Multiple distances, moving targets, shooting from different positions. She missed the first few shots, overshooting or undershooting like someone getting used to the weapon's characteristics. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, every shot found its mark. When they moved to the long-range rifle, a Remington 700 with a Leopold scope, the other recruits stopped their own practice to watch. The targets were at 500 yards, difficult shots even for experienced marksmen. Wind was gusting across the range, adding another layer of complexity. Sophia took her time setting up, adjusting the scope with small, precise movements. When she finally fired, the shot took everyone by surprise. Dead center. She worked the bolt, fired again. Same hole, 5 shots, 1 hole at 500 yards in gusting wind. Torres set down his binoculars very carefully. "Mitchell," he called to his assistant, "get Colonel Hutton, now." While they waited, he had her shoot again. Different weapon, different distance, but the same impossible accuracy. By the time Hutton arrived, a small crowd had gathered, watching this woman in tattered clothes put rounds through the same hole over and over again. The colonel watched through binoculars as she fired a final group, then walked over to where she was breaking down the rifle. "Chen," he said, his voice different than it had been during that first formation. "Where did you train?" She looked up at him, hands still moving over the weapon with practiced ease. "Here and there, sir. Gun ranges mostly." He studied her for a long moment. "No gun range teaches that kind of shooting. That's military precision, special forces level." She shrugged, a small movement that gave away nothing. "I practice a lot." But Hutton wasn't buying it anymore. He'd seen too many operators to be fooled by the act. The shabby clothes, the quiet demeanor, the way she'd taken harassment without complaint. It was all starting to look less like weakness and more like camouflage. That night in the officer's mess, he pulled her file again. Still nearly empty, just that name and clearance code. But the code itself was interesting. He'd seen similar ones before, attached to people whose real files were kept in buildings with no signs and guards who didn't officially exist. He made a call to an old friend in military intelligence, describing what he'd witnessed. The friend listened, asked a few questions, then went quiet for so long, Hutton thought the line had dropped. "Brad," the friend finally said, "if she's who I think she might be, you need to be very careful. There are people who aren't supposed to exist, who've done things that never happened. Sometimes they surface in places like yours for reasons we're not cleared to know. Don't push too hard. You might not like what pushes back." The night navigation exercise should have been routine. Teams of 4, moving through dense forest to reach designated checkpoints, testing land navigation skills and teamwork. Sophia was paired with 3 recruits who made no effort to hide their displeasure at being stuck with her. Thomas Wright, self-proclaimed wilderness expert with all the latest gear, took point without asking. Sarah Kim and Daniel Martinez fell in behind him, leaving Sophia to bring up the rear like an afterthought. They had 6 hours to hit 5 checkpoints scattered across 20 square miles of rough terrain. Wright led them in the wrong direction within the first hour. He was too proud to admit it, too stubborn to check the compass Sophia quietly offered. By hour 2, they were hopelessly lost, the darkness complete under the canopy, their flashlights dying one by one because Wright had insisted they didn't need spares. "We're going to fail because of you," Sarah spat at Sophia, as if being lost was somehow her fault. Sophia looked up at the small patch of sky visible through the trees, then at the moss on the nearby rocks, the way the land sloped. "Southeast," she said quietly, "about 3 miles. Wright laughed bitterly. "Right, like you would know. What, did your welfare caseworker teach you land nav?" She didn't argue, just started walking southeast. After a moment, having no better option, they followed. She led them through the darkness like she could see in it, avoiding deadfalls and rough patches by instinct or invisible signs only she could read. Within an hour, they'd found the first checkpoint. The second checkpoint was near a stream, and Wright insisted on leading again. He got them turned around at the water, leading them upstream instead of down. Sophia corrected course without saying anything, just gradually adjusting their direction until they were heading the right way. Wright took credit when they found the marker. By the 4th checkpoint, even Wright had given up the pretense of leading. They followed Sophia through the darkness, watching her move through the forest like she was born to it. No stumbling, no hesitation, reading the land like a map only she could see. They finished 2 hours early, the only team to hit all 5 checkpoints. The others came in lost, exhausted, several missing markers entirely. When the instructor asked Wright how they'd done it, he started to take credit, then caught Sophia's eye. She wasn't threatening him, wasn't even looking at him particularly hard, but something in her gaze made him reconsider. "Chen navigated," he admitted reluctantly. "We just followed." The instructor, the same Rodriguez who'd overseen the combat matches, made another note in his mental file on Sophia Chen. Land navigation like that wasn't learned at gun ranges or from YouTube. That was trained, ingrained, the kind of skill that came from operating in places where getting lost meant dying. The pool training was supposed to be a great equalizer. Water didn't care about your background or how much your gear cost. The exercise was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Full combat gear, weapon included, treading water for 20 minutes, then swimming 500 meters, then retrieving a weight from the bottom of the pool. Most recruits barely made the 20 minutes. The weight of the gear, the drag of waterlogged fabric, the psychological pressure of potential drowning, it broke people. Marcus made it 12 minutes before being pulled out, gasping and retching. Jessica lasted 8. her expensive athletic wear becoming an anchor that nearly killed her. Sophia entered the water without hesitation, despite her boots being held together with duct tape that immediately began to dissolve. She treaded water with economical movements, using the minimum energy necessary to stay afloat. Her breathing remained controlled, steady, even as others around her thrashed and panicked. At the 10-minute mark, her left boot came apart completely, the sole separating from the upper. She kicked it off without missing a beat, compensating for the uneven weight. At 15 minutes, when most of the remaining recruits were showing serious distress, she looked like she could continue indefinitely. The swim was harder with one boot, throwing off her balance, but she adjusted her stroke to compensate. She finished in the middle of the pack time-wise, but she was one of only 3 who completed it without stopping. The weight retrieval from 15 feet down she did in one breath, staying under long enough that the safety diver started moving toward her, only to surface just as he reached her position, weight in hand. Captain Morrison, the pool instructor and former Navy rescue swimmer, pulled her aside afterward. "That breath hold was over 2 minutes," he said. "That's not normal, that's trained." She squeezed water from her remaining boot, not meeting his eyes. "I've always been good at holding my breath." He studied her for a moment, then asked quietly, "Which unit?" She looked up then, and for just a second he saw something in her eyes that made him take a step back. Something cold and dangerous, quickly hidden behind that bland expression she wore like armor. "I don't know what you mean, sir," she said, and walked away, leaving him with the certainty that Sophia Chen was not what she appeared to be. The incident that changed everything came during week 3, during what should have been a routine demolitions demonstration. The recruits were observing, not participating, watching from what was supposed to be a safe distance as the demolitions expert, Sergeant Cooper, showed them how to properly rig C4 charges. Something went wrong. Whether it was old wiring, a faulty detonator, or simple human error would be debated for months afterward. But in the moment, all that mattered was that Cooper was still at the demonstration site when the charges started their countdown, trapped by a piece of rebar that had somehow gotten wrapped around his ankle. The digital timer showed 30 seconds. Cooper was 200 meters away. The blast radius was 150 meters. The math was simple and deadly. Everyone froze. Some shouted. A few started running toward him, then stopped, realizing they'd never make it in time. Hutton was screaming into his radio for emergency services that wouldn't arrive for 10 minutes. Sophia moved. Not dramatically, not heroically, just moved with the same quiet efficiency she did everything else. She covered the distance to Cooper in a flat sprint that would have impressed Olympic coaches, producing a multi-tool from somewhere in her shabby clothes as she ran. 20 seconds. She didn't try to untangle the rebar, didn't waste time on the impossible. Instead, she went straight for the charges, her hands moving over them with a familiarity that should have been impossible for a recruit who'd never handled explosives before. 15 seconds. Cooper was screaming at her to run, to leave him, but she ignored him, focused entirely on the wiring in front of her. She isolated one wire, traced it to its connection, made a decision that would either save them both or kill them instantly. 10 seconds. She cut the wire. The timer stopped at 7 seconds. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Cooper's ragged breathing and the distant sound of sirens. Sophia helped him untangle the rebar, supporting his weight as they walked back to the observation point where everyone stood frozen in shock. "How?" Hutton asked when he finally found his voice. "How did you know which wire?" She set Cooper down gently, letting the medics take over. "Lucky guess," she said, but her hands were steady, not a trace of adrenaline shake, and everyone who knew anything about explosives knew that what she'd done wasn't guesswork. It was expertise. That evening, Hutton made more calls, this time to people whose names didn't appear in any directory, whose offices didn't officially exist. He described what he'd seen, what Sophia had done, and waited for answers that didn't come. Instead, he got warnings. Stop digging. Stop asking questions. Some stones were better left unturned, but the other recruits had seen too much to ignore anymore. The woman they dismissed as a charity case had just saved someone's life with skills she shouldn't have. The dynamic in the barracks shifted overnight. The pranks stopped. The laughter died. In its place came something between respect and fear. Marcus was the first to crack. He cornered her one evening, away from cameras and witnesses, his usual bravado replaced by genuine curiosity mixed with unease. "Who are you, really?" he asked. "No bullshit. No one learns that stuff from YouTube or gun ranges." She looked at him for a long moment, seeming to weigh options in her mind. Then she pulled out a worn photograph from her pocket, showing it to him briefly before tucking it away. The image was blurry, but he saw enough. A younger Sophia standing next to several figures in black tactical gear, their faces obscured, a helicopter in the background that looked military but had no markings. "I'm exactly who I said I was," she replied. "Sophia Chen, here to train. But that photo never happened," she cut him off. "Those people don't exist. That place isn't real. And if you're smart, you'll forget you saw anything." She walked away, leaving Marcus with the growing certainty that they'd been training alongside someone who'd lived in shadows most of them couldn't imagine. The medical evaluation was mandatory for all recruits at the halfway point. Basic physical, blood work, the usual. But when the doctor, Major Patricia Wells, examined Sophia, she found things that didn't belong on a civilian. Scar tissue from what looked like bullet wounds, at least 3, old fractures that had healed without proper medical attention, burn marks in patterns that suggested torture rather than accident, and on her left shoulder blade, partially hidden by what looked like an old tattoo removal attempt, the ghost of something that made Wells's blood run cold. She'd seen that mark once before, years ago, on a patient who'd been brought in under heavy security. No name, no records, just orders to save his life and forget he existed. The mark of a unit that supposedly didn't exist, doing operations that never happened, in places that weren't on any map. Wells documented the standard findings, but kept the rest to herself. Some knowledge was dangerous to have, more dangerous to share. But she watched Sophia leave with new understanding. This wasn't a recruit. This was a weapon someone had tried to decommission, now being reactivated for reasons Wells didn't want to know. The sniper challenge came in week 4. One shot, 1,000 yards, wind gusting to 20 miles per hour. It was meant to be impossible for recruits, a lesson in limitation. The best any previous class had managed was within 10 feet of the target. Sophia took her position without ceremony, settling behind the rifle with the patience of someone who'd waited in worse places for longer times. She didn't take the shot immediately, just lay there, breathing, feeling the wind, reading patterns in the air that others couldn't see. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the bullet took 4 seconds to reach the target. 4 seconds where wind could push it off course, where a million variables could interfere. The spotters called it simultaneously. Direct hit, dead center. The range fell silent. Even Torres, who'd seen her shoot before, couldn't quite process what he'd witnessed. That shot wasn't just good, it was impossible. The kind of shot that got written up in after-action reports that were immediately classified. "Again," Hutton ordered, his voice tight. She worked the bolt, adjusted for a wind change so subtle no one else had noticed it, and fired. Another direct hit, the bullet passing through the same hole. By the time she'd put 5 rounds through a space the size of a quarter at 1,000 yards, several people were recording on their phones, despite regulations against it. This was history being made or revealed, depending on how you looked at it. Jessica, who hadn't spoken to Sophia since the pool incident, approached her as she was cleaning the rifle. "How?" she asked simply. Sophia glanced up, seemed to consider the question seriously for the first time. "When you've had to make shots like that, when missing meant people died," she said quietly. 1,000 yards on a range feels easy. It was the most she'd ever revealed about her past. And Jessica walked away knowing she'd been cruel to someone who'd seen and done things that would probably break most of them. The night ambush exercise was supposed to be controlled. Instructors with paint rounds, simulating an enemy attack, testing the recruits' ability to respond under pressure. But someone had switched the paint rounds for blanks in one rifle, and when the exercise began, the sound was different, more real, more dangerous. Most of the recruits reacted as expected, diving for cover, shouting, general chaos. But Sophia moved differently. She went low and fast, not toward cover, but toward the threat, moving through the darkness like she owned it. By the time the instructors realized something was wrong and called a halt, she was behind their position, having ghosted through their entire perimeter without being seen. Rodriguez found her there, crouched in the shadows with a rock in her hand that she'd been prepared to use as a weapon. When he asked how she'd gotten through their lines, she shrugged and said she'd followed the gaps in their fields of fire. But those gaps were invisible in the darkness, theoretical spaces that only someone with extensive combat experience would even know to look for. The investigation into the ammunition switch turned up nothing conclusive, but Sophia was seen cleaning her gear with extra attention that night, checking and rechecking equipment like someone who'd learned the hard way that paranoia kept you alive. Week 5 brought the survival exercise, dropped in the wilderness with minimal supplies. Find your way back to base within 72 hours. Most recruits traveled in groups for safety. Sophia went alone, disappearing into the tree line like smoke. She was back in 18 hours, not the scraped, exhausted, dehydrated mess everyone expected, but clean, fed, hydrated. When asked how she'd managed it, she mentioned finding edible plants, purifying water from streams, navigating by stars, all technically possible, all completely implausible for the timeline. What she didn't mention was the cache she'd found, or rather gone straight to, hidden coordinates that weren't on any map the recruits had been given. Emergency supplies, left by someone who'd known she'd need them, or left by her on some previous visit to these woods. Either possibility raised questions no one wanted answered. The final week brought everything together. A combined arms exercise involving every skill they'd learned. Teams of 8, competing scenarios. Winners would graduate with honors. Losers would still graduate, but without the recommendations that opened doors to elite units. Sophia was assigned to a team that included Marcus, Jessica, and 5 others who'd grown wary of her over the weeks. They didn't trust her, but they'd learned to respect her abilities. The exercise involved assaulting a mock embassy, rescuing hostages, and extracting under fire. During the planning phase, Sophia stayed quiet while the others argued tactics. Marcus wanted a frontal assault, Jessica preferred stealth, the others had their own ideas. Finally, Thomas asked Sophia what she thought. She studied the building layout for a moment, then began speaking in a quiet, measured tone. 3 entry points, she said, tracing routes on the map. 2 diversions here and here. Main assault through the service tunnel that isn't on your map, but trust me, it's there. Hostages will be on the 3rd floor northwest corner because that's the only room with reinforced walls. 2 guards, maybe 3. The extraction point they've marked is a trap. The real one will be here. She marked a spot 500 meters from the official location. How can you possibly know that? Marcus demanded. She looked at him steadily. Because it's what I would do. They followed her plan. Found the service tunnel exactly where she said it would be. The hostages were precisely where she'd predicted. The official extraction point was indeed compromised, but the alternative she'd identified was clear. They completed the exercise in record time with 0 casualties, moving like a unit that had trained together for years rather than barely a month. But during the exercise, something happened that changed everything. As they breached the main floor, Sophia's shirt caught on exposed rebar, tearing from her shoulder down her back. The fabric fell away, and in the harsh, fluorescent light of the stairwell, everyone saw what she'd been hiding. The tattoo was intricate, beautiful, and terrifying. A serpent wrapped around a skull, but not just any serpent. This one had details that made several team members step back. Each scale contained a tiny symbol, coordinates perhaps, or names, or operations. The skull wasn't human, but something else. Something that suggested death had many faces, and beneath it all, barely visible, were words in a language that looked Cyrillic, but wasn't quite. Thomas, who'd served in army intelligence before washing out, went pale. "That's," he started, then stopped, unable or unwilling to finish. Sophia pulled her torn shirt closed, but it was too late. They'd all seen it, and those who recognized even part of what it meant understood they'd been training alongside someone who shouldn't exist. The exercise continued, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Her team moved around her like planets around a sun, following her lead without question. When they encountered the instructors playing enemy forces, she neutralized them with a casual efficiency that looked more like dance than combat. Rodriguez, playing an enemy commander, found himself face down with her knee in his back before he even heard her approach. "You're dead," she whispered in his ear, and he believed her, had the absolute certainty that if this had been real, he would be. When they reached the extraction point, helicopters waiting to simulate the evacuation, Colonel Hutton was there. He'd been watching the exercise through cameras, had seen the shirt tear, had seen what was revealed. His face was unreadable as Sophia's team approached. "Chen," he said, his voice carrying over the rotor noise. "A word." She followed him away from the others, stopping in the shadow of a building where they couldn't be overheard. He studied her for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with what to say. "I've made some calls," he finally said. "Interesting thing about those calls. The people I tried to reach either don't exist, their numbers are disconnected, or they very politely told me to stop calling. You're a ghost, aren't you? One of the ones we're not supposed to know about." She didn't deny it, didn't confirm it, just waited. "Why are you here?" he asked. Real answer this time. She glanced back at the other recruits, then met his eyes. "Because sometimes ghosts need to remember how to be human again, and sometimes humans need to remember that ghosts are real." He processed that, then asked, "The tattoo. Is it what I think it is?" She pulled her shirt aside just enough to show it clearly. Hutton sucked in a breath. He'd heard stories, legends really, about a unit that handled things too dark for even black ops. Their calling card was that tattoo, earned through trials that made this training look like summer camp. "They said you were all dead," he murmured, "that the whole unit was wiped out 3 years ago." "Dead is relative," she replied. "Sometimes it's easier for everyone if certain people stay that way." Before he could respond, an alarm pierced the air. Not the training alarm, but the base's actual emergency signal. Both of them turned toward the command center where lights were flashing and people were running. Rodriguez sprinted up to them, his face grim. "Sir, we have a situation. 3 armed individuals have breached the perimeter. They're heading for the armory." Hutton reached for his radio, but Sophia put a hand on his arm. "Let me," she said quietly. "You're a recruit," he started, then stopped. She wasn't really, was she? Never had been. She moved toward the armory without waiting for permission, shedding the pretense of inexperience like an old coat. The other recruits watched her transformation in real time. The shuffling gait became a predator's stalk. The rounded shoulders squared into perfect military bearing. The woman they'd mocked for weeks became something that made their training look like children's games. The 3 intruders were professionals. That much was clear from their movement patterns and equipment. They disabled the cameras, neutralized the guards with non-lethal precision, and were working on the armory's lock when Sophia arrived. She didn't announce herself, didn't call for backup, just moved through the shadows until she was close enough to hear them whispering in accented English. Russian, maybe Ukrainian, talking about a buyer, a timeline, weapons that weren't supposed to exist. The first one never saw her coming. She disabled him with a blood choke that took 8 seconds, lowering his unconscious body silently to the ground. The second heard something, turned, found himself looking at a small woman who shouldn't have been threatening, but somehow was. He reached for his weapon. She broke his arm before his hand got halfway there, the crack echoing in the night air. His scream cut off as she struck his throat, not hard enough to kill, but enough to silence. He dropped, gasping, unable to call out. The third was faster, smarter. He got his weapon up, finger on the trigger, aimed at her center mass. For a moment, they stood frozen, predator and predator recognizing each other. "You're supposed to be dead," he said in accented English. "The whole Viper unit. We confirmed the kills." She tilted her head slightly. "You confirmed bodies, not the same thing." His finger tightened on the trigger, but she was already moving. The shot went wide as she closed the distance, getting inside his guard, her hand finding the pressure point that dropped him like his strings had been cut. He fell, twitching, still conscious but unable to move or speak. By the time base security arrived, all 3 intruders were restrained with their own zip ties, conscious but subdued. Sophia stood apart from them, her torn shirt fluttering in the night breeze, that tattoo visible to everyone who'd gathered to watch. Hutton approached slowly, like someone approaching a wild animal that might spook. "The base commander wants to debrief you," he said carefully. She shook her head. "My handler will be here soon. This wasn't random. They came for me." As if summoned by her words, the distinctive sound of helicopters filled the air. Not the standard military birds, but something sleeker, quieter, with no markings or identification. They landed on the parade ground, disgorging figures in black tactical gear who moved with the same predatory grace Sophia had displayed. One figure approached, removing a helmet to reveal a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter ice. She looked at Sophia with something between affection and exasperation. 3 years, she said, 3 years of being dead, and you decide to resurface here?" Sophia shrugged. "I was bored." The woman laughed, short and sharp. "Bored? Right. And I suppose it's coincidence that Volkov's people found you." She gestured to the 3 restrained intruders. "Nothing's coincidence. They've been hunting us since the operation in Chechnya. Someone leaked the location." The gray-haired woman nodded, then turned to Hutton. "Colonel, I'm Commander Sarah Webb, Defense Intelligence Agency, though if you check, you'll find I don't exist. We'll be taking Chen with us, along with our 3 friends here." "She's a recruit," Hutton said weakly, though even he didn't believe it anymore. Webb smiled, cold and sharp. "She's many things, Colonel, but recruit isn't one of them. Captain Chen has more operational experience than most of your instructors combined. She was here as a favor to me, a chance to decompress after 3 years of being dead. Apparently that's over now." "Captain?" Jessica said from where the recruits had gathered to watch. "She's a captain?" Webb glanced at her dismissively. "Among other things, ranks don't really apply to people who don't officially exist." Sophia walked over to where her fellow recruits stood. These people who'd mocked her, dismissed her, and ultimately learned from her. She stopped in front of Marcus, who'd led so much of the harassment. "You wanted to know who I really am," she said quietly. "I'm someone who knows what it's like to be underestimated, to be dismissed, to have people make assumptions based on appearance. It's kept me alive more times than I can count. But it's also lonely. So thank you, all of you, for reminding me why I do this, why people like me exist, so people like you can learn to be better." She turned to Elena, the quiet one who'd watched everything with knowing eyes. You saw it from the beginning, didn't you? Elena nodded. My sister was Special Forces. She told me stories about people like you, ghosts who handle things too dangerous for anyone else. I thought they were myths. Some myths are real, Sophia replied, and sometimes they shop at thrift stores and wear duct-taped boots. She walked back to Webb, who handed her a black tactical jacket, identical to the ones the other operatives wore. As she put it on, covering the torn shirt and the tattoo that had revealed so much, she transformed one last time. The uncertain recruit became the operative, the disguise falling away completely. What happens to them? Hutton asked, gesturing to the intruders. They'll disappear, Webb said simply. They'll be questioned, their networks traced, and then they'll cease to exist. Just like we don't exist, just like none of this happened. But we all saw... No, Webb cut him off. You saw a training accident. Some recruits got too aggressive during an exercise. Nothing more, the cameras malfunctioned. The reports will reflect this. Are we clear? Hutton nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what wasn't being said. The other recruits remained silent, processing the reality that they'd witnessed something that would officially never have occurred. Sophia paused at the helicopter's door, looking back one last time. She found Rodriguez watching her and offered him a small salute. He returned it, understanding passing between them, warrior to warrior. As the helicopters lifted off, disappearing into the night sky, the recruits stood in stunned silence. Everything they thought they knew about their training, about strength and weakness, about judgment and assumption, had been shattered in the space of a few weeks. Derek was the first to speak. We tortured her. All those pranks, the harassment, and she could have killed us whenever she wanted. Jessica nodded, her usual confidence gone. She saved Cooper's life. After everything we did to her, she still saved him. Marcus picked up something from the ground. It was the duct tape from Sophia's boots, fallen off during the confrontation. He held it up, this symbol of what they'd mocked, now understanding it had been part of a disguise so perfect they'd never questioned it. The next morning, training resumed as normal, or what passed for normal, but the recruits who'd witnessed Sophia's truth were changed. They moved through their exercises with new humility, understanding that strength came in many forms, that the most dangerous person in the room might be the one everyone overlooked. Rodriguez incorporated new lessons into the training, stories about operatives who'd used appearance as camouflage, who'd turned society's assumptions into weapons. He never mentioned Sophia by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. In the barracks, her bunk remained empty but untouched, a silent reminder. New recruits arrived, full of the same arrogance and assumptions, but the ones who'd known Sophia took it upon themselves to teach different lessons, to look deeper, to respect everyone until proven otherwise, to understand that sometimes the person you're mocking might be the one who saves your life. Weeks passed, then months. The story of the woman in thrift store clothes became legend, told in whispers, details shifting with each telling. Some said she'd been a Navy SEAL, others claimed Delta Force. The truth, that she belonged to something even more secretive, was known only to a few. Then, 6 months after she'd left, a package arrived for Colonel Hutton. No return address, no delivery record, it simply appeared on his desk. Inside was a photograph. Sophia and her unit, faces visible this time, standing in what looked like a destroyed urban environment. She was smiling, a genuine expression none of them had seen during her time at Blackstone. On the back, in neat handwriting, still shopping at thrift stores, still underestimated, still standing. Hutton framed the photo and hung it in his office, where every new recruit would see it during their initial briefing. When they asked about it, he would tell them a simple truth: never judge someone by their appearance. The most dangerous person you'll ever meet might be wearing duct tape boots and a torn shirt. A year later, Thomas Wright, who'd failed to navigate during that night exercise, was deployed to Afghanistan. His unit was pinned down, taking heavy fire, when support arrived from an unmarked helicopter. The operative, who fast roped down, moved like liquid shadow, neutralizing threats with surgical precision. He never saw her face clearly through the tactical gear and night vision. But when she helped him to the extraction point, she said something that made his blood freeze. "Still think southeast is the wrong direction?" Before he could respond, she was gone, vanishing back into the helicopter that officially was never there. But he knew. They'd been saved by a ghost, one who remembered every face, every slight, every moment of her time pretending to be weak. The reports from that mission were heavily redacted, but Thomas kept his own record, a reminder that somewhere out there, moving through the shadows, was a woman who'd endured their mockery while possessing the skills to end them all, and she'd chosen to save them instead. Back at Fort Blackstone, new recruits arrived, confident and cruel in the way young soldiers often were. They mocked the weakest among them, established their hierarchies through harassment and strength. But always, there were those who'd heard the stories, who watched for signs that perhaps the person they were dismissing might be more than they appeared. Jessica, who'd left the military and gone into private security, found herself hiring people others overlooked. The small, the quiet, the ones with patches on their clothes and steel in their eyes. More than once, these choices saved contracts, saved lives, saved her company. She'd learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, and she never forgot it. Marcus went into law enforcement, rising quickly through the ranks. But he never forgot the woman who'd shown him how wrong first impressions could be. When reviewing candidates, he looked for the ones who didn't fit the mold, who had gaps in their records that might suggest more than met the eye. Some of his best detectives were people others had dismissed as not cop material. Elena, always the observer, went into intelligence work. She had a gift for seeing what others missed, for recognizing the operators hiding in plain sight. More than once, she identified foreign agents who'd embedded themselves in everyday roles, using the same camouflage techniques Sophia had demonstrated. Her reports often referenced lessons learned from an unnamed source at Blackstone, lessons about the danger of assumption. Derek left the military entirely, haunted by how close he'd come to seriously hurting someone who could have destroyed him without effort. He became a teacher, working with troubled youth, trying to pass on the hard-won wisdom that everyone deserved respect until they proved otherwise. When his students mocked the weak or different, he told them about the woman in duct-taped boots who'd turned out to be the most dangerous person he'd ever met. The armory at Fort Blackstone was upgraded after the breach, with new security systems and protocols. But those who'd been there that night knew the real security had worn a torn shirt and moved like death itself. The three intruders were never seen again, their fate a mystery that no one tried too hard to solve. Rodriguez kept teaching, incorporating more and more of what he'd learned from watching Sophia. The way she'd moved, the economy of motion, the patience. He couldn't teach the years of experience she'd had, but he could teach the mindset. That survival often depended not on being the strongest, but on being underestimated. Colonel Hutton retired 2 years later, but not before implementing new training protocols that emphasized respect and observation over raw aggression. The culture at Blackstone shifted, slowly but noticeably. Hazing decreased, teamwork improved. The quality of graduates rose significantly. In his retirement speech, Hutton told one last story about a recruit who taught him more than he'd taught her. He didn't name names, couldn't given the classification levels involved, but everyone who'd been there knew. He spoke about the danger of assumption, the power of humility, and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances. 3 years after Sophia's departure, a new crisis emerged. A terrorist cell had taken hostages in an embassy in Eastern Europe. The situation was deemed impossible by conventional forces. Too many variables, too much risk, too little intel. The kind of operation that required people who didn't officially exist. The news coverage was limited, carefully controlled. But those who knew what to look for saw the signs. The too perfect resolution, the hostages who seemed dazed but insisted their rescuers had been angels. The single frame of footage, quickly scrubbed from the internet, showing a small figure in black tactical gear with a familiar way of moving. Thomas Wright saw that footage before it disappeared. He recognized the gait, the posture, the deadly grace. He knew who'd saved those hostages, even if the world never would. Somewhere out there, Sophia Chen, or whatever her real name was, continued to stand between civilization and chaos. The recruits from her time at Blackstone stayed in touch, an informal network bound by shared experience. They traded stories of mysterious encounters, of being helped by someone who shouldn't have known they needed help, a figure in shadows during a dangerous operation, intel that arrived from no traceable source. Guardian angels with familiar tactics. They came to understand that Sophia's time at Blackstone hadn't been random. She'd been there to remember how to be human, yes, but also to teach them something crucial, that the world was protected by people they'd never see, never know, never be able to thank, people who endured mockery and dismissal because their true nature had to remain hidden. 5 years passed. The legend of the thrift store ghost grew with each telling. New recruits heard versions that were more myth than reality, but the core message remained: respect everyone, judge no one by appearance. The person you dismiss might be the one who saves your life or ends it, depending on which side you're on. Then, on a cold winter morning, another package arrived at Blackstone, this time addressed to the entire base. Inside was a simple note: the work continues. The shadows remain. Thank you for reminding me why it matters. No signature, but included was a patch, the kind units created for operations that never happened. It showed a serpent wrapped around a skull, eerily similar to a certain tattoo, with Latin words beneath: numquam visus, semper vigilans. Never seen, always watching. Hutton, called back for the occasion despite his retirement, had the patch framed and mounted in the main hall with a simple plaque: in memory of those who serve in silence. The stories continued, spreading beyond Blackstone to other bases, other services. The woman in thrift store clothes became a cautionary tale, a teaching moment, a legend. Operators in various special units claimed to have worked with her, though none could prove it. Intelligence agencies had files that didn't officially exist on an operative who wasn't real. But for those who'd been there, who'd seen her transformation from mocked recruit to lethal ghost, she was something more. She was proof that true strength didn't announce itself, that the most dangerous people were often the ones who chose not to show it, that sometimes the person everyone dismissed as worthless was actually invaluable. Marcus, now a police chief, kept a photo on his desk from their training days. It showed all the recruits, and there in the back, barely visible, was Sophia. Small, unremarkable, easily overlooked. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the lesson she'd taught them all. Never judge, never assume, never underestimate. The years rolled on. Wars came and went. Threats emerged and were neutralized, and somewhere in the shadows, operations continued that would never make the news. The people involved didn't exist, the missions never happened, but the world kept spinning, a little safer because of ghosts like Sophia Chen. At Fort Blackstone, each new class heard the story. Details changed, embellished or forgotten, but the core remained. They learned about the woman who'd endured their predecessors' cruelty with quiet grace, who'd saved lives despite having every reason not to, who'd shown them all what real strength looked like. Some dismissed it as myth, a cautionary tale invented by instructors to promote better behavior. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone would arrive who moved a little too quietly, whose skills seemed a little too polished, whose background was a little too sparse. The instructors would watch these ones carefully, wondering if another ghost had come to walk among them. The truth was, Sophia's mission at Blackstone had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. She'd wanted to remember how to be human, but she'd also planted seeds of humility, respect, and understanding that grew in ways neither she nor her handlers could have predicted. The culture of elite military training shifted, subtly but significantly, because of one woman's willingness to be underestimated. In the end, the greatest operations were the ones that changed minds rather than eliminated targets. The most effective weapons were the ones that taught rather than destroyed. And sometimes the most powerful statement was made by someone who never raised their voice, never threw a punch in anger, never revealed their true capabilities until the moment demanded it. The woman they'd mocked for her thrift store clothes and duct-taped boots had given them something invaluable. The knowledge that strength comes in many forms, that appearances deceive, and that the person you dismiss today might be the hero you need tomorrow. Somewhere out there, in a world of shadows and secrets, Sophia Chen continued her work. Still shopping at thrift stores, still underestimated, still standing between the darkness and the light. And at Fort Blackstone, her ghost haunted every interaction, a reminder that everyone deserved respect, because you never knew who might be hiding behind torn clothes and quiet dignity. The story never truly ended. It just went underground, like she had, surfacing occasionally in whispered tales and impossible operations. A legend born from truth, teaching lessons that would echo through generations of warriors. The woman everyone had mocked had become the standard by which they measured themselves, not in strength or skill, though she'd had both in abundance, but in the grace with which she'd borne their cruelty and the choice she'd made to save rather than destroy. That was the real lesson of Sophia Chen, the ghost of Fort Blackstone. That true power wasn't in what you could do to others, but in what you chose not to do, even when they'd given you every reason to. That was the mark of a real warrior. That was the legacy she'd left behind, written not in official records that didn't exist, but in the hearts and minds of those who'd learned, too late to apologize but not too late to change, what real strength looked like. It looked like duct-taped boots and thrift store clothes hiding a warrior's heart. It looked like silence in the face of mockery. It looked like choosing to save those who'd hurt you. It looked like Sophia Chen, the woman who'd taught them all that the most dangerous person in the room was the one everyone underestimated. And somewhere, in a place that didn't exist, she was still out there. Still watching, still protecting, still shopping at thrift stores, a ghost with a scarred heart and steady hands, standing guard in the shadows so others could live in the light. That was her choice, her burden, her gift to a world that would never know her name, but would always be safer because she'd walked through it. The recruits at Fort Blackstone didn't know it, but every night when they slept safely in their barracks, it was because people like Sophia Chen chose to live in the darkness. And every morning when they woke to train, they carried with them the lesson she'd taught. Never judge, never assume, never underestimate, because the person you mock today might be the ghost who saves you tomorrow.